Hello everyone, and welcome to this very interesting morning talk. And I'm delighted to have such a wonderful group of people here, as well as many representatives of local Christian communities. We have a special representation brought by Father Brito, who's the interfaith director for our diocese, from other faiths. So you are particularly welcome today. We are going to hear a presentation from Father John Deehan. And you say, oh, Father John Deehan. Father John Deehan, he and I can't go into a lot of detail because this is going back over 50 years, yes, when we were both students at the Biblical Institute in Rome, which is the place where you go to learn about the Bible if you're a Catholic and you're driven by the great Jesuit experts. Please come in. And John and I began our studies there around about 1974. Yeah, okay, so we should by now know a little bit about the Bible. But maybe we don't. Maybe the more you discover, the more you realize you don't know. As one of our famous professors said, you can become so aware of the complexities of a particular text, you just realize how much there is that you don't know. And surely that is right if we're dealing with this God-given word. So I'm delighted that Father John has had the courage to take up this particular topic, which, well, it says the Holy Land, which seems pretty sort of innocuous, but then it says gift or entitlement. Well, what does that mean? And you'll find that what we're actually looking at is something to do with how we should read our scriptures, Jewish and Christian as they are, how we should read them and what that means. Now, if you are kind of political people, which I imagine coming to a talk like this you will be political people, and you'd think back again roughly that amount of time, maybe to the late 60s. I remember the war of 1967 and how through decades I think my heart has been yearning for a resolution of the issues of Palestine and Israel. And now, in the last few years, as you know, we've come to very serious developments, all kinds of repercussions. It is time that we asked ourselves, what are the real issues here? And what does our faith say? It's a topic that many people are scared to look into. And you can understand why. Huh? But I'm not here to give you the way forward, thank God. It is Father John who's been teaching scripture in London particularly, but also all around the place for as many years as I have, and that's quite a few. You put the two of us together and it gets to more than 100. Sorry?
Into the centuries.
It gets into the centuries. So we're going to have about 45 minutes talk, and then we'll have a nice break for lunch, and then we'll come back again for another session, and I'm sure having questions and discussion at the end. So thank you very much for coming, and please welcome Father John Deehan. Thank you.
When Adrian and I finished together in Rome, Adrian went straight back to work in teaching in Monash, and I got another year. I managed to persuade Cardinal Basil Hume at the time to let me go to Jerusalem, and so I had a year in which I was able to spend a lot of time actually in the land rather than just simply chained to a desk studying texts. And that's where I got my love for the land and the beginnings of a love for the Christian communities there. About 16 years ago, I had the opportunity of returning to my origins in the Dominican school in Jerusalem to study and to visit some of the parishes in Israel and the West Bank. And one of the parishes that I revisited was Taibe. And Taibe is a remote village not far from Jerusalem or from Ramallah, which is the capital of the Palestinian Authority. And Taibe is unusual because it's a totally Christian village. In that village you find Greek Orthodox, you find Melkites who are in union with Rome but follow an Eastern liturgy, and what are called there the Latin Catholics, what we would refer to as Roman Catholics. Now, in most towns and villages of Palestine, Christians have been in the minority since 1948 because a massive number of Muslims were expelled from their homes and they took refuge where they could. So Bethlehem, for example, again went from being a totally Christian town to a sort of a half and half. And gradually many Christians have been leaving Bethlehem and the country, and so they're becoming almost a minority in their own place. Now, over the years, the Israeli occupation has become much more brutal, and many families have left. And one of the things that I've become aware of as I've gone on as well is that as a church, they're part of our family. They're part of our Christian family, and we need to support them as well. Now, as you come to the village of Taibe, you'll see the ruins of the Church of St. George. And the Church of St. George was built in the 5th century. So there's evidence there of a long Christian association with that place. And in fact, its inhabitants trace their Christian origins back to the beginnings of Christianity. And they associate their village with a place called Ephraim, which is mentioned in John's Gospel. It was the place that Jesus retired to after the raising of Lazarus, when the authorities began to plot to kill him. Now, in recent times, Israeli settlers have begun harassing Palestinian villages in the West Bank, villages like Taibe, with the tacit support of the government and the Israeli army and police. They set fire to cars and to olive trees, which is, the olive trees are the heart of their economy. They threaten to fire churches and houses and have attempted to do that as well. And when the villagers call the emergency services, the Israelis hold them at checkpoints, because every village there now has a gate in front of it blocking the road, so nobody can get in or out without soldiers' permission. And the Israelis hold the emergency services at the checkpoints in the name of security. And this is all part of a government plan to drive them off their land and make a Palestinian state impossible. Now we come to the biblical part of it. When the settlers are challenged, and I've picked this up from documentaries on our own television, their response is very simple but very forceful, and it can be persuading if you don't know too much. They appeal to biblical tradition and say, God gave us this land and now we are claiming it back. It's as simple as that. The Palestinians have no right to be here. It's the language of conquest, of establishing facts on the ground, and it reflects the policy of the present Israeli government. Now, the appeal to biblical texts, in this case, all I'm referring to today is the Old Testament, so the kind of level playing field, if you like, with the Jewish tradition. And this appeal to biblical texts at face value, because what it's doing, is frequently used by the Prime Minister and members of the Israeli government, and it's also used in Donald Trump's White House, which is advised and encouraged by a number of Protestant evangelical fundamentalist pastors. So, for example, they will assert that God is a God of war. And they'll say, well, if you don't believe that, read the Bible. It's there in front of you when you read it. Now, that is, to us, that is very compelling. Now, think of what Pope Leo said in his Palm Sunday homily. He was talking about Jesus, and he said, "This is our God, Jesus, King of Peace, who rejects war, whom no one can use to justify war. He does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects them, saying, 'Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood.'" Now, if you remember at the time, just round about Easter time, Trump and company reacted quite considerably to this, and they said, "Oh, Pope Leo, he's not a politician, he doesn't understand, he doesn't this, that and the other," which is what, of course, is always said of the prophets. It took a little time before people became evident that we began to realise that the Pope was actually referring to a biblical text, to Isaiah 1:15. Now, we didn't hear any of the White House pastors at that stage coming back and saying, "Read your Bible," in defence of the Pope. But that just gives us an indication of how complex this subject is. So whatever I say today, be sure it's not the last word on the topic. It's very easy to take passages at random from the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, which we are not, as Catholics, so familiar with, and to use them as proof texts in the service of politics. We put God on our side, but when we actually look at these sayings in their context within a particular chapter or within a particular book of the Bible or the Old Testament as a whole, then the reality doesn't appear so simple. And many Jewish rabbis would agree with that as well. So in this talk, I'll be confining myself to the biblical writings we've inherited from and share with Judaism and are less familiar to Catholics, namely the Old Testament. Briefly stated, the Old Testament story is about land. Land acquired, land lost, land restored, but never possessed. So let's begin by doing a broad sweep of the Old Testament story, and that's what we've got on the slide there for you. The story in the Old Testament is a story of the land which is roughly equivalent to what was known as Palestine before the Second World War. Its foundation story tells how the people who came there had been slaves in Egypt, who were miraculously rescued by God under the leadership of Moses, and after wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, arrived in a land that God had promised them. Their stay in the land was long, a matter of a few centuries, but it turned out not to be permanent. We see the Israelite inhabitants of the land first as a group of clans and tribes who in time became a nation ruled by a king. And the kingdom established by Saul and consolidated by King David and Solomon divided into two kingdoms, roughly 70 years later. So we're talking about, take 70 away from 1,000 and you're there. Of the two kingdoms, the first and the greater kingdom and the richer kingdom was the kingdom in the north. It had much more land than Judah had in the south. But that disappeared when it was invaded by the Assyrian Empire and its inhabitants deported around 722 BC. So already, if you like, the vision of the land was being restricted. The smaller kingdom of Judah lasted much longer, but eventually that was invaded by the Babylonians. Most of the leadership and its well-off and influential inhabitants were taken into exile, first in Babylon, and later they dispersed throughout the Hellenistic world, and so they are known even to today as the diaspora, the dispersion. The loss of the monarchy, the loss of the temple in Jerusalem, and the loss of the land was catastrophic. It was an unexpected challenge, too, to Israel's whole faith and identity. After about 70 years, a small number of people returned and rebuilt Jerusalem and the temple, though on a much smaller scale than it was before. And after that, the biblical story more or less comes to an end until New Testament times. And by that time, the people were under Roman rule, and they were feeling like exiles in their own homeland. And of course, those political tensions that you can see behind many of the gospel stories, particularly the passion and death of Jesus. Historically, we can put a timeline on that story, which I've put on the slide for you. Scholars will debate some of the dates, particularly as you get up towards the dates of the Exodus and the so-called conquest. So we can date the Exodus, the liberation from Egypt, insofar as whatever happened, as early as 1450 BC or as late as 1250 BC. This is part of what we call the late Bronze Age, when climate change and a demand for new land and resources saw many people on the move. And when the Hebrews arrived in the land, they gradually organized as a kind of tribal confederation, because the if you like, family links were almost as important as place. Place, of course, then becomes important because families can gather there. By 1000 BC, the tribes are governed by kings. The first king is Saul, and he's followed by David and by King Solomon. Solomon is the great ruler. He expanded the state, and he also is remembered as a man of great wisdom. It's around about this time that writing actually begins, and writing, of course, was begun in the times of the kings because writing suited them. It helped them to administer their kingdom more efficiently. It helped them to promote themselves, to put up great plaques and columns in their name, and tell about the wonderful things that they had done, particularly their conquests. Around 930, the kingdom broke up into two parts: a larger kingdom in the north and a smaller one in the south. Because one has to remember that right through this biblical thing, round the corner from Israel were the Great Bears. There was Egypt in the south, who had been, in fact, governed the land round about the sort of time of the Exodus, and then there were later the Assyrian Empire fell and was replaced by the Babylonian Empire. So there were always kings always wanted land, and big kings wanted big land, basically. The Jews, however. Most of the inhabitants then of Judah was a small state, and in 587, after two other attempts, the Babylonians finally invaded and destroyed the kingdom, deported the king and the inhabitants to Babylon and elsewhere. The first returnees came back to Jerusalem about 70 years after, and that's often associated with the beginning of Judaism as we know it. It's the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, who will pop up a little bit later in the story. However, the Jews never really enjoyed for much time the independence they had under the kings, except for a very brief period from about 142 to 63 BC. Then the Romans became their occupiers. In 70 AD, after a revolt by the Jews, the Romans destroyed the temple. They killed or enslaved many Jews. After a second revolt in 132 to 136, the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, and the emperor changed the name of Judea to Syria Palestina, from where our Palestine comes. Life for those who remained, the few Jews who did, became very restricted, and the majority of Jews emigrated and joined the large diaspora that had grown up over the previous centuries. Now we move on to we got it up already, the slide on the Hebrew scriptures. No, you're one ahead, so we need to go back. Okay. Now, the Bible, as we know it, you probably have heard this before, it's more like a library of books than, for example, a novel that we might begin to read from beginning to end. Because I can assure you that if you try and read the Bible from end to end, you may do it, yeah, but you're a better man or woman than I am. And by the time you get to the book of Leviticus or that, you'll begin to wonder whether life is worth living at all or not. Now, the Jews divide their library into three, and I say that because there's a slight difference between the way that Christians classify their library and Jews do. We're going to stay with the Jewish classification for today. Now, they divide it into three. So you've got Torah on the left. They call it in Greek Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Law, Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, Ketuvim, writings. Now, the Torah comes from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is much more than law, because whereas Exodus gives you the foundation story of the people, in Deuteronomy, Moses sort of recaps that story and then moves on to look at the future and to look at life in the land. Now, Torah, interestingly enough, ends with the people at the boundary of the land. So they don't, when Torah is over, they don't actually cross over. Now, for the Jews, Torah is the most sacred part of the Bible, and the Torah scrolls are still carried in procession in the Jewish liturgy. And it's a story that, on the surface, looks forward to life in the land. The second part of the story is called the prophets, and that reflects what life in the land was like. And that's divided into two parts. You have a narrative part, where the story is told, and you also have then the great prophets, and that's where you sometimes get down to the real details of what was actually going on behind the story. The story is very much about if only you had done this, you would be secure in the land now, but you didn't. Right? The final section is called the writings, and this includes the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which recount the return of the exiles and the building of the Second Temple. It also includes the Psalms and a collection of wisdom literature and other writings that were produced after the exile. So we move on to the Old Testament library. Now, just as important as the timeline of Israel's history is the historical timeline of the writing of the biblical books themselves. And this is a little bit more difficult to pin down. So, if you have objections to say, well, hang on, shouldn't that be this date? I'll say to you, well, there's lots of other people too that need to hang on, like that. Now, the basic story of how the Hebrew slaves came to the land, lived in the land, and lost the land is told in the book of Torah and in the former prophets. It'd be best described as a collection of memories, some of which began by being transmitted orally, from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. Others were written down. And the general scholarly consensus is that these memories were edited and given their final shape in the period after the exile in 587. And the question that the editors had in mind at this stage was the question, why did this catastrophe happen? Why did we lose the land? And the fundamental answer that they gave was not a political one. It was not about chancellors not giving enough money for defence or anything like that at all. But rather, their answer was a theological one, that the people refused to listen to God and obey the commands that had been given to Moses on Mount Sinai. They preferred to follow the false gods of their surrounding neighbours. And this is not a question just of religion and going to church, so to speak. This is about what are the values that are being promoted by the two religions as well. So the verdict of the people who wrote the former and latter prophets and what we call the Deuteronomic history is that they had failed to acknowledge the fundamental premise that underlied their stay in the land. And that's expressed in the book of Leviticus, Now this is one of the little gems, but you might as say, reading the book of Leviticus, you mightn't get to the gems because you'll have lost all hope by that stage. But this is what God declares to his people. He says, "The land belongs to me, and to me you are only strangers and guests." So in the sight of God, the people who lived in the land were never actually the owners of the land. Now we see a similar understanding of, I think we need to move on, stay where we are for the moment. Yeah. We seem to see a similar understanding of land ownership in the prophet Zechariah, who's the very last of the prophets in the Jewish canon. He preached to the returning exiles, so we're at the sort of the end of the story when most people are in exile now. And he jogs their memories of the fundamentals with a message of hope and spiritual renewal. And so he preaches, "The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land and will again choose Jerusalem." Now, interestingly enough, that is the only mention of the term Holy Land, which is so familiar to us in the whole of the Old Testament. Otherwise, it's never mentioned as such, although God will talk about the land being holy. So, offering a word of hope, the prophet promises that Jerusalem will become the possession of the Lord, once again, a sacred space, open not just to the exiles, but to many nations. So the prophet had a much bigger vision, much broader vision than the people he was actually speaking to. The first inhabitants of the land are not the people, but God who opens the land to many nations. In other words, it's not God's plan that they will have the place to themselves. Now, the other thing to remember about, I think, when one was reading the Bible, is that if God comes out and makes a statement like this, it's usually because somebody else is saying the complete opposite. So what you have actually in the Bible is not just storytelling, and certainly not just pious storytelling, but you've also got debate going on at this stage. So we tend to know the land not for people to keep to themselves. So, just to refresh on Zechariah's prophecy again, "Many nations shall join themselves to the Lord on that day, and shall be my people, and I will dwell in your midst. And you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem." So the land is holy, because God is present in its midst, in its own in his own land. Remember that earlier quote from Leviticus, "The land belongs to me, and to me you are only strangers and guests." Now, interestingly enough, that was not a message for outsiders, but for the insiders, the people who were in the land. And it was written in the context of the Jubilee year, which is where the church got the idea of the Holy Year every 50 years from. And it was about land and about debt. Because what happened is that because of the economic circumstances that grew worse in fact grew, I think, basically with it becoming a state under a king. But small landowners often couldn't survive. If you had too poor autumn and spring when there was no rain, then often small landowners were driven into debt and had nothing to barter with. And so the aspiration of this community who's taking their cue from their God is that this is not right. Those who have become slaves and haven't been able to pay off their debts had to be returned to freedom along with their land. Land could not be just simply sold on forever and the original inhabitants not given any hope. In other words, he said God did not bring his people out of Egypt in order to enslave them again. So Leviticus goes on to say that everyone, whether you're a debtor or whether you're a master, whether you're land dispossessed or a landowner, you are servants of God. And indeed, God's holiness extends to the land itself. God, if you remember, rested when he created the world. He rested on the seventh day, and the people must rest too. But so must the land have its Sabbath rest. And every farmer knows this. That the land needs its rest not every week, but every 7 years if it's to remain fallow. So one might say that the holiness of God, land and people forms one divine ecology, so to speak. Ecology is not a word that the Green Party invented. It's around long before that. Why was land in itself important? Number 7. Now, before we look at the theology of the land, we might ask, why was the land so important in this period of history? Now, remember, this is a civilization where there are no banks, there are no industrial economy as such. Rather like those of you who were at at Father Alban's talk will remember, this is when banks came into being in a big way, when Francis was alive. But this was a land where land was the basis of the economy. Land gave crops, land fed animals that could be used by the owners, and the surplus enabled trade. In the late Bronze Age, where land was fertile, towns and cities grew up. And before the time of the kings in Israel, though, the majority of inhabitants would have been small farmers. The land that we know as Palestine was, in fact, quite fertile on the whole. It doesn't look that fertile as you move up towards Jerusalem, up through the mountains. But even there, with careful work on it, the people were able to create little places where they could grow vines and that, even if they were only tiny plots of land. So the fact, if the land had good yields, and much of it did, that meant that it had good, it was able to produce farming things that could go beyond the needs of the immediate family or the extended family or clan, and that in turn led to the growth of small cities. And then, of course, the elites come along and they're able to exploit that, and you develop trade and so on, and you begin to own the surrounding land as well, and you profit from the land of others. And Palestine was situated on what is called the Fertile Crescent. We'll come to that in a sec. So the more land one owned, the more security and social status one had. So if you didn't have a lot of land, then land was very precious to you, and it was handed down from generation to generation. And hence you have a story in the first book of Kings, in chapter 21, about a man called Naboth, who probably had more land than some, but he lived on the boundary of the king's land. And the king said to Naboth, he said, your land that you've got there will be very useful to me, because I could buy. And he didn't actually say this, but I'm saying it. He's like, I could build a nice swimming pool there and things like that, and have a nice, comfortable thing. And Naboth says, "No, I'm not going to sell this land, because it is. If I lose this land, my family lose it. Everybody loses it, never to be got back." Similar arguments today about selling church property. If we sell it, we're not going to get it back, and it's the developers who will win out. So Naboth was not prepared to sell his land for the personal convenience of the king. Now, the land of Israel itself was located on what was called the Fertile Crescent, a fertile crescent of land that was bordered by desert on one side and sea on the other. So Israel stood on a trade route that went from Arabia around to Egypt. I say, but certainly on that Mediterranean side, and I think that would be true on the other side, rainfall was unpredictable. It only comes in the spring and in the autumn. And if the rain didn't come, crops would not be forthcoming, and for the poorer people, that meant famine. And that's why you get stories so much about famine in the book of Genesis, pushing Abraham back into Egypt and out again, and so on. So as society becomes more sophisticated, land took on a political function. Large empires were able to grow because their rulers were able to appropriate more land to feed their, we call them civil servants, to feed their armies and to store the surplus. And in time, this left the ordinary people poorer. And actually, there's a big debate in the first book of Samuel about this, and because the people want a king because they feel they're going to be safe. You know, a bit like we've got to get our defence thing in operation at the moment. So, and Samuel says to them, okay, well, if you want a king, you can have your king, but watch out. It's not going to work in your interests. And so what actually happens is that the poorer people begin to get poorer. They have to borrow food from the king and wealthier people, but the interest rates were equivalent to something like 20 or 30%. So, not cheap. And also, of course, at this time there was no coinage either. I mean, we go out and you know that your 50 pence is worth 50 pence, and that's it. And okay, there's inflation in the background and so on, but at least nobody's going to come to you and say this is only worth 25 pence, like that. Now, in Israel at this time, the only medium of exchange, apart from bartering, was what was called weighed silver. So you said, well, you give us that, and we'll give you a little piece of silver, which was cut off and put on. Now, of course, poor people couldn't afford the scales for these things themselves. And so they're at the mercy of unscrupulous money changers. And we hear a lot about that in the prophets as well. And eventually, the poor were unable to pay their debts, and they became tenants of the king. And there was nothing surprising about that. That had been going on in Egypt for hundreds of years. The land was all owned by the king there. But that's the kind of background against which we must read the biblical stories. The population of the neighbouring empires of Assyria, and later Babylon, and Egypt, were effectively permanent tenants of the kings, or people survived sometimes because they were called up to be in the army or to work for the king, and they probably got a subsistence level of food. Now, a king could, if he wished, give some sort of amnesty for times. But that was not part of the system in the way that the biblical aspiration would want it to be. And so at one level, the nation becomes more powerful, but is usually at the expense of its own people. So when you read it against that context, the Bible becomes not just a pious book that's somehow irrelevant to real life, but a powerful countercultural attack on the values of the elites who benefited from the prevailing economic and social reality. The wilderness, learning the values. Now, we go back now to the period of the wandering in the wilderness. That forms a large part of the book of Exodus and later the book of Numbers. And it's important because it's during this stage that the people are exposed to the values that they will need if they are later to survive in the land. So it's not by chance that Moses' first request to the Egyptian Pharaoh to give his people freedom is linked to the worship of God. Let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival for me in the wilderness. That's the word which Moses transfers to Pharaoh. Survival in the wilderness will depend above all on trusting in God and trusting in the leadership of Moses, who is given privileged access to God. Above all, survival will depend on their understanding that everything that the people receive in the desert comes by way of a gift from God. Hence you have those stories about the miraculous feeding with manna from heaven, and the giving of quails from the sky, and the water which Moses struck the rock, and the water came out. Who would have dreamt that there was water behind the rock? So what they have to do is they have to learn how to use but not exploit the resources that God gives them. Need takes precedence over desire. So when in defiance of Moses' orders, they hoard the manna in the expectation that we might be able to have a bit more next day, they actually lose it. It just goes rotten by the next morning, and they have to wait for the next manna fall to come down. So this journey, of course, through the wilderness proves to be a test of faith. Even though the manna comes from heaven every day, the people soon tire of the gift. They even express a desire to return to slavery in Egypt, to the free fish from the Nile and the varieties of food that were produced thanks to the consistency of the water in the Nile. And it's only Moses' faith and resilience that keeps them going, although Moses' faith is actually stretched to the limit. And yet, in all their time in the wilderness, we're told, the people did not starve. They lacked nothing. And she says Deuteronomy chapter 7. Why? Because they lived by miracle. And the miracles were there already in the desert, waiting for them. So the book of Deuteronomy then witnesses to the values that were taught in the wilderness experience. The book of Deuteronomy is an important witness then to the values that the people will need if they are to survive in the land as they survived getting there. So basically the book of Deuteronomy presents itself as a teaching document, the teaching of Moses as the people arrive at the boundary of the land and prepare to cross. Now Moses is not going to cross himself. Moses got into some sort of trouble with his leadership and with the people, and as a result, something happened. We're not quite sure what it was, but Moses never got to see the promised land. So it's the teaching of this is the teaching of Moses as he arrives at the promised land. They're up on Mount Nebo. They can look down. You can see the River Jordan. If you've been on pilgrimage, if ever been on pilgrimage to Jordan, you probably would have been brought to Mount Nebo, and you can see masses of the Holy Land there. In fact, you're on the Holy Land effectively. Anyway, so Deuteronomy, of course, is also the conclusion of the first part of the Bible, the first 5 books: Torah, Law, the most precious part of the Jewish scriptural heritage. And it is interesting where the story ends then. It ends at the boundary. The people see the land, but it's as if they never possessed it. And I would suggest that that's the theological anchor of the story. Remember that the books of Torah were written in their earliest form in response to the loss first of the northern kingdom and then later the kingdom of Judah. So what happens is that the stories begin, the memories are there already, the memories sort of get passed on and passed down, and they became, people sort of sift them through and that. And then there's a big editorial effort at the end in Babylon and coming back into Jerusalem. So while the land on the other side is characterized as a land of milk and honey. So in other words, it's the land of milk. Of course, you can think of it. There are places where you can bring up cattle and sheep, so you've got milk. And it's going to promise a new settled way of life, but that's going to bring its own temptations and its own testing. The book of Deuteronomy and the historical books that it influences are effectively an inquest on how the Israelites lost the land, having failed to recognize that the land was a gift from God, linked to the covenant that God had made with Moses on Mount Sinai in the desert, and the stipulations that were enshrined in Torah, that again are presented as having been given to Moses along with the 2 tablets that contained the 10 Commandments. So in Deuteronomy 8, Moses calls the people together, and he reminds them who has given them the land. And this is what he says: "Beware of saying in your heart, 'My own strength and the might of my own hand won this power for me.' Remember the Lord your God. It was he who gave you strength and won you this power, thus keeping the covenant then, as today, that he swore to your fathers. And be sure, if you forget the Lord your God, if you follow other gods, if you serve them and bow down before them, I warn you today, you will most certainly perish. Like the nations the Lord is to destroy before you, so you yourselves shall perish, for not having listened to the voice of the Lord your God." So in other words, there's no free lunch. You have to if you want to live in the land, you've got to think. The nations that God is supposed to have destroyed, these are the nations who didn't live according to these values, which are essentially human values as well.
Yeah, another couple.
Right. Okay. Okay, lovely. So the land will not be empty, as if it's waiting for Israel to possess it. So now we become aware of the elephant in the room, with its reference to the destruction of the nations. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, Moses will warn the people that the land, that they're not just going to be able to walk into the land and find it empty. They'll be living with some very powerful neighbours, including tribes known as the Anakim, which basically means giants. They're bigger than they are. And that would again make sense, because those who were in the land and were going through a good time, of course they grew, and they're bigger than these people who've just been foraging in the desert all the way along. So by the time Deuteronomy came to be written, though, the Anakim were actually past history. It was said that Joshua conquered them at Hebron on his way in to conquer the land. And, of course, the most famous son of the Anakim was Goliath, who was killed by the young shepherd David. So Moses addresses a certain number of people who are very reluctant to go into the land at this stage. And they're saying, in effect, let's not go there. There's going to be, there's going to be big people in there. We're not going to survive over there. It's a little bit like your tennis player who's not one of the big champions, and they get to the last set and then they suddenly get wobbles, can't get in. So Moses says to them, with words of encouragement, "Know today that the Lord your God is the one who goes before you as a devouring fire. He will defeat them, so that you may dispossess and destroy them quickly, as the Lord has promised you." But with this promise again comes the warning. "Do not say in your heart, 'It is for my own goodness that the Lord has brought me to possession of this land.' No, it is for the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is dispossessing them for you. Be sure it is not for any goodness of yours that the Lord gives you this rich land to possess. For you are a headstrong people." So not only is the possession of the land a gift, not a reward, but maintaining possession requires openness to the commandments of the Lord. Possession of the Lord is no guarantee of security. And of course, when they get into the land, all they'll have to do is to look around them. But we're not terribly good at looking around ourselves. See, when you read these Old Testament stories, think of the Bible as a mirror, and that you're looking in at this mirror, and what you actually see is not just past history, but we see ourselves in it as well. So, he says, failing to obey God is going to lead to disaster. "If you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments, I will set you high above the nations of the earth. But if you do not obey the Lord will send upon you disaster, panic, and frustration in everything you attempt to do, until you are destroyed and perish quickly because you have forsaken me." And of course, when you read the history, as it's told by the Deuteronomists, that's what actually happens. There's several near misses, several escapes, but you're always under the big bear, Assyria, and the big empires, and eventually they got them. Now, there are some quite difficult texts in Deuteronomy.
Well, let's have a break.
We'll have a break then. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good time.
Okay, so
Good time to stop.
maybe we have a break until, what do you reckon?
What time is it now?
20 to 1? 20 to 1, how about that? You've got food and you've got drink, all right? Just to call the attention to Edmund Adamus, who's at the back there, who's come representing Friends of the Holy Land. If you want to find out about that organisation, he's got some material at the back.
Yes, if you don't know the Friends of the Holy Land, do have a look at that, because they are doing amazing work over there. I hate to use the word amazing because there's another president who uses it quite a lot. But it is truly amazing, amazing work that's done over there. And they really are because one of the things is that the Christians who are over there love being in the Holy Land. Their faith is very much centered around that. They don't want to leave. A lot of them just have had no option but to get out. So it's a real test of faith, and it is bringing out tremendous faith. We used to support it by going on pilgrimage. Theoretically, you still could go on pilgrimage, but it's got its difficulties, and a lot of people are scared to go anyway. But the Friends of Holy Land, they're about over 10 years now in existence. They've been supporting the communities over there in different ways, from families through to little schools, institutions, universities, hospitals, and all that. But I'll leave it to Edmund to tell you the story about that.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. See you in...